In 1929, Hergé created one of the most famous and loved characters of the 20th century, Tintin.
As a boy interested in aeroplanes and space rockets and things, I was immediately taken by just the beautiful illustrations of Hergé.
He was this fantastic draftsman. Those clean lines and the colours.
Tintin became a reflection of Hergé's Boy Scout ideals, and his adventures created a graphic history of the 20th century.
He covers both angles, the fantastic artwork and the narrative. So it's unique, really.
I used to read The Dandy and the Beano, of course, comedy comic strips, and it was really set apart from those. It felt more real.
The worlds and characters he would create captivated a generation.
I'm still taken by the shady dealings, the shenanigans, the darkness, the international espionage.
I was totally drawn into Tintin's world and immersed myself in it.
It's 221B Baker Street, it's M's office, and he has that quality of creating an entire world.
Born in Belgium, 1907, Hergé saw the horrors of war as a boy. Europe had to be rebuilt from ruin. The continent was crippled by recession, and the rise of fascism was becoming notable. The stench of war was everywhere.
That is the background. You're heading out in the world, and behind you is the war. It colors everything.
In Belgium, a young Catholic Boy Scout called Georges Remé would draw from these horrific experiences to create Tintin.
So the stories I read in the comics were about destruction and war, and they seem to be part of the normal landscape.
Remé's close ties to the church, particularly priest Norbert Wallet, led him to work for ultra-conservative newspaper Le Petit Vétien. It was here that Remé gave birth to both Tintin and his pen name, Hergé.
Well, interestingly, I discovered that Hergé got his name by reversing his initials on his original name. So I think there was a bit of the espionage about him. So I suppose in his own way, he was a sort of a Belgian John le Carré.
Under the influence of right-wing newspaper Le Petit Vétien, Hergé began Tintin's adventures, and from the start, he would be seen as a little controversial.
As a young man, he was, I think, very heavily influenced by his kind of Catholic patron, and he was almost told that these were the politics that he had to adhere to.
I'm not sure I did think about Hergé too much to begin with. I mean, I think he speaks through his art, and it was only later that I came to discover the origins of Tintin and some of the controversies.
As a cartoonist, you do satire, so what you snarl at, is kind of a mirror image of yourself, really. If you do a cartoon against the church, for instance, well, it indicates that you may well be an atheist, and political cartoonists, of course, have their hearts on their sleeve.
The first adventure, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, was essentially a piece of propaganda depicting the Soviet Union.
Hergé did study as much as he could of the photographs coming out of the Soviet Union at the time, of which there weren't many. People didn't really know what was going on inside the Soviet Union at the time. It's quite a coup for Tintin, the young reporter, to actually get behind there and expose some of what genuinely was going on. So here's Hergé exposing something that genuinely went on in the Soviet Union. So although it's quite clear where the book is coming from, there's also some worthwhile reporting going on in there.
What Hergé told us about those conflicts in faraway places kind of simply resonated to some extent with us. We just sensed that the world was a bit complicated.
In the early 1930s, Hergé began Tintin's second adventure and referenced Belgium's disastrous attempt at the colonisation of Congo at the turn of the 20th century.
There are those, hence, who've argued that he was a racist in the way that especially African people were depicted in those books.
I cannot mount a defence for it. I mean, you read the book and it's just flat out racist. It's actually pretty disgusting, and knowing some of the things that the Belgians got up to in the Congo, quite perhaps of its time, shall we say.
I think he is on very dodgy kind of political ground, and you can see that, you know, he's kind of under orders and all of this stuff, and he doesn't really know very much of what he's writing about. He's going very much on received wisdom.
Hergé is often criticised now for, you know, being a bit of a, well, proto-fascist almost when he was young, but he was young, you know, and in the early part of the century, the prevalent mentality was still basically Victorian.
I don't think there was an awful lot of malice in there, to be honest. And they are such fantastic life-affirming stories in the end that I can't believe that he was a man with hatred in his heart, because I actually think Tintin is full of love and full of humour and full of humanity.
For the third instalment in the Tintin series, Hergé ventured into America. His excitement and passion for a country he knew from films and adventure novels shone through.
Tintin in America was always one of my favourites when I was a boy. There's something about the cowboys and Indians setting that really appealed.
I have a horse you can use for a few days. I got just the one for you. Her name's Beatrice.
Hello, Beatrice.
You can see his love of cowboys and the Wild West and all the adventures that in small town Belgium must have just been an incredible idea. And that's when I think you start to get the real love of adventure, the love of this big wide world. Because in many respects, throughout, Tintin is an innocent abroad. That's kind of what he is.
Tintin in America also included the ultimate baddies of the era, the American gangster.
That's Tintin's hotel room on the 37th floor. Just make sure you don't miss.
Hergé even featured the real-life kingpin, Al Capone.
Al Capone's train is arriving from Chicago, and the crowd is rushing to get a glimpse of the ex-big shot. A sedan is waiting to take him to prison, and here he is, still sporting his big white hat.
If you're a European and you're living in Belgium, then at the time, who are going to be the big characters and big faces in American life, other than politicians and film stars? I suppose it would be the bad boys, the Al Capones.
Gangsters always appeal to small boys, and having Al Capone in there and some of the gunfights that they have, standing on the side of the sedan cars or Cadillacs and sort of machine gunning each other is terrifically exciting.
One of the things that's great and timeless about Tintin is that they are both of their time, and he brings in contemporary issues and characters and all of that, but they are all also timeless. It's good against evil. It's you know, it's eternal boys stuff.
Huh? Hands up! You're under arrest. Tintin, thanks to you, we've landed a very big fish.
It was that whole idea of sharing the adventure with other boys at school. I mean, there's been that big criticism that there are no girls in Tintin's world, and was Hergé a sort of misogynist. I don't think that's the case. I think, you know, if you're writing Boy Scout drama, then girls tend to not feature in that world.
These first three adventures showed an obvious progression for Hergé and Tintin. Although they're not his most acclaimed books, they set the format for the future.
The early books, Land of the Soviets and Congo and Tintin America, were not so widely published in Britain, I don't think, in the 60s and 70s when I started reading the books. And they're not really the ones that I was focusing on.
It's proto Tintin. It's still in the making. They don't hold together. They're episodic. Every page you have a new incident. And Tintin bumps into a bison, bumps into an Indian. There's no coherence to it. He's finding out his feet, and even graphically, in some of the earlier stories, there's a kind of awkwardness. Facial expressions, for instance, where you can see that Tintin's mouth, I'm sure that gave him trouble. He didn't know what to do with the mouth. You can see the change, and I think it happened in Pharaoh's cigars, actually. The line becomes assured. It's more fluent.
Hi, I'm Tintin, reporter.
Well, Tintin the reporter. The winds of fate have just blown the story of a lifetime your way.
Oh?
I, Sophocles Sarcophagus, am about to unearth the lost tomb of the pharaoh Kiosk.
After the rather dodgy Tintin in the Congo and the anti-Soviet propaganda of Tintin in the land of the Soviets, you can tell he's moving towards a more humane politics. There's a fabulous bit where Tintin is actually fighting drug smugglers, and you find out what the drug growers are actually doing to this village. One of the leaders explains in quite a lot of detail about how the villagers are forced to grow opium poppies. It is interesting that Hergé didn't have to do that. It didn't have to explain it in that details, but he did, and there's a certain amount of that sticks in the mind of a 10-year-old, I think.
It was difficult to travel, and so Hergé had to carefully research the places he was illustrating.
If Hergé didn't go to any of those places, then fair play to him. But of course, if he didn't go to any of those places, the way that he depicted them would be based on photographs, or they'll also be based on kind of stereotypical ideas of how people act and who they are. And his imagination just created those worlds based on whatever information he could garner.
If you haven't been there, you would reach into your store of cliches, in effect.
Somebody was talking about references to Japanese ancient paintings in the way that he draws the curves of the waves in the sea. And the minute you start thinking like that, you can see that there are those references.
And your reader might not be able to be aware of it, but it does register. There is something, that's what great art actually is made of, this little manipulation that you are totally unaware of, but it gets you in.
In 1934, Japan occupied China. Hergé objected to the conflict, and he used it as a background for his next Tintin adventure, the Blue Lotus.
Well, I remember being terribly impressed by that. I mean, I was 10 years old. I didn't know about the international concession in Shanghai.
Uh-oh. I think we're lost.
In the book, it does look different. You've never been to China. You don't know what a Chinese house looks like. But I just trusted Hergé. I trusted him.
Hergé paid particular attention to Oriental drawing style to bring authenticity to the story. He had been introduced to the architect Chang Chong-chen, who made him pay more attention to Oriental art.
Hergé decided that if he was going to have Tintin moving around the world, he better get serious about researching. So I believe he went into collaboration with Chang and collaborated with him on how to use the calligraphy and how to depict the Chinese buildings.
Hergé became good friends with Chang, and his appreciation ended with him writing him in as a character in Tintin's adventures.
My name is Tintin.
And I'm Chang.
Okay, Chang, off to Hukao.
It's something that he would return to again and again, always researching very meticulously, travelling if he could in order to put Tintin's adventures in the most realistic possible setting.
South American jungle, this green hell, a ghastly struggle is being waged between Bolivia and Paraguay. These are the first pictures of the war. Meanwhile, the second line moves up. Death on its way. The wounded, the dying, everywhere. The living must go on over the top.
Hergé had a taste for illustrating conflict and controversy through Tintin's adventures. His next adventure, Tintin and the Broken Ear, was a fictionalized version of the Grand Chaco War that was being fought between Bolivia and Paraguay over oil fields.
Oil was everything, and Tintin is already a seasoned international troubleshooter.
But I think it's that fear of big business, isn't it? When big business influences big government, then you can go to war on the premise of money, you can go to war on the premise of oil. There's a Tintin story where two countries are set against each other with the promise of oil in another country, and it's not there. And so that whole idea of going to war on a tuppence, just to turn a coin, is very relevant, isn't it?
Once again, the rattle of a German army on the march echoes in Europe. Where that march may end, no man can foretell, least of all the man who gave the order. But here before our eyes unfolds the drama of a nation dying. You have seen the map change once again in Europe. Take warning and offer yourself for national service.
Is this the last attack upon a small state? Or is it to be followed by others? Is this in fact a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force?
Just before World War II broke out, Hergé produced The Black Island and was inspired by one of the most popular films at the time, The 39 Steps, directed by Alfred Hitchcock.
If you look at his works before the war, you can see that he's no fascist.
That should keep him inside until the tide finishes him off.
There's never a good German character in Tintin. If there's one rule, it's that if there's a German, it's likely to be dastardly.
Finally, a village. Maybe we can rent a car here, Snowy.
And when he comes to England in the Black Island, it's particularly interesting. England is presented as a very calm and quiet and peaceful country, and I believe there were some objections from the German occupying forces in Belgium at the time that he'd presented England as such a positive and kindly, benign place.
A deserted town in Belgium, cleared for the action of two colossal armies. Before the savage onslaught of a mighty enemy, Belgian troops have been relieved by British, after withstanding the most tremendous attack in the history of the world. And along every road that leads south, the refugees are passing in a weary stream that seems to have no beginning and no end. Only with more and still more planes can we drive this foul horror from the skies.
During this time, Hergé produced King Ottokar's Scepter, which was a clear response to the Nazi invasions. The tale featured pro-fascist group, the Iron Guards, headed by fictional leader Mustler, which was a blend of the names Hitler and Mussolini.
These are very serious charges you make, Mr. Tintin.
It's set in the Balkans. You know, the Balkans then as now were a place of huge upheaval and unrest.
I will study this further and confer with our security police. Then I will join you with the king.
The story was dangerous, and with the promise of war from Germany, it left Hergé vulnerable.
Had I written this story, I would not have stayed. So he was lucky. I mean, you have the huge propaganda apparatus of the Nazis looking at every single printed word, and not just what was going to be printed, but what had been printed. I mean, fascists have long memories, they're highly sensitive people,
worst fear came to life when German forces invaded.
This is the pathway of an invading army. Wreckage on all sides. Houses and shops, churches and schools, alike battered into unrecognizable heaps of rubbish. And along every road that leads south, the refugees are passing in a weary stream that seems to have no beginning.
Have left.
It's very difficult though, 70 years hence, to make judgments about what people had to do or didn't have to do at a time where there was such an evil group of people who had invaded your country and were running it.
Tragedy creeps on towards every home in Belgium like an oncoming tide. These families in feverish haste prepare to leave before the invader, to join the march of refugees while enemy planes threaten from above. A minute will pass, and they will turn their backs upon a home which they will never see again.
During the Second World War, of course, there wasn't much of anything. In terms of fuel, food, light entertainment, there was very little you could do. So I'm sure just to keep body and soul together, working and earning, was the right thing to do.
In France, I mean, there's quite a number of entertainers, Maurice Chevalier, Charles Trenet. They stayed there. And at the end of the war, people say, you're a bloody collaborator because you just stayed.
I think quite often with these incredibly hard-working artists, they're not necessarily political. But it was obvious that if you wanted to carry on working in occupied Europe at that time, you had to toe the line.
Hergé produced 6 stories during the war, which avoided any controversy. Instead, he offered escapism through the adventures of Tintin.
The work that he did under the Nazis actually pushed him away from the political storylines he had been exploring and towards rather sort of lovely escapist fantasies, which are some of his most charming works, I think. They're the works that he produced in an extraordinary burst of creativity, and actually they're some of the most enduring, I think.
That's strange. I've never noticed that star before. I smell a story here. Come on, Snowy.
But what I love about it is it's Tintin expanding his horizons, and he's looking up to the stars, and it is about meteorites falling, and it kind of goes beyond the earthly confines, and yet it's still just a classic great Tintin adventure, and it's got boats, and it's got biplanes, and it's got kind of what would then have been the latest technology. It's just a really, really good story.
That's pure escapism, and the authorities must have liked that.
Wow! Look at this! Now we're getting somewhere.
Crab with the golden claws. It just sounds like something from a Bond film. It's brilliant, before I was even aware of James Bond.
The war years also produced Tintin's most famous sidekicks, who would go on to become lifelong favourites.
The characters were just brilliant. Just brilliant. Everyone, like Snowy the dog and Captain Haddock.
They're all good because they've all got the essential elements. You can't do Tintin without Tintin and the quiff and the clothes and Snowy with the bone in his mouth and Captain Haddock with, all those wonderful alliterative kind of phrases and insults.
Ah, here we go. My nose, billions of blistering barnacles. What a line.
And the great thing about what Hergé came up with is that he came up with a drunk to start with. It's a beauty, Haddock is marvellous.
The Thompsons, to some degree, are kind of Lestrade. They're the bumbling cops that appear in crime fiction pretty much throughout. And Calculus, who's that great, he's the trust me, I'm a scientist figure. They're just such great stock characters that wherever they go in this world or out of it, you know, up into space or down into the seven seas, they're just great characters.
Tintin's sidekicks, although a welcome addition to the series, were unusual characters to have alongside the young Belgian hero.
They all seem to be almost like surrogate parents to him. Haddock, Calculus, the Thompson, they're old enough to be his parents.
And it allows him to move throughout the world without the encumbrances that adult characters have. So there's a certain innocence there as well, which is interesting.
Today, if Haddock was Tintin's dad, Tintin would be on the at-risk register because he'd be a terrible parent, taking him on these adventures and drinking the way he does and with the violence. So he's not aspiring to be like these adults, but he wants them in his world. So pretty much it's a dysfunctional setup, isn't it? Tintin's the only one really with any real credibility.
You always get the sense that Tintin is from a little place. He wouldn't work if he were British, which was the kind of dominant power of the time. It works because he's plucky little Tintin from plucky little Belgium, from this small place that doesn't have anybody famous except Tintin.
And then again, it could be a metaphor for Belgium. It's a small country, small young country, and it's surrounded by older, more powerful and dangerous countries.
When the war ended, Hergé's very survival meant that he was once again accused of being a Nazi collaborator.
At the end of the war, you have a lot of patriots coming out of the woodwork. They were in the resistance all along, that sort of thing. They want to find the guilty parties, the whiter than white, self-righteous characters. You emerge out of this dreadful thing with, well, actually no moral standing at all. Hergé was one, and he must have asked himself, well, could I have done this, could I have done that?
But he's a cartoon. It's not meant to be the real world. And I think it's only because he's such a believable character that you even start to do that. He's a line drawing with a quiff. And you have to remind yourself of that.
He was banned from newspapers for 2 years. Although the charges were unfounded, the stress pushed him to a nervous breakdown in 1947. Tintin was put on ice. When Hergé returned, he finished many of the books he had started during the war, which were still grounded in fantastic escapist adventures, featuring the new regulars of Haddock and Calculus.
A river! This is our only chance, Snowy!
This is probably my favourite of them all, partly because it's one of the ones that kind of acted almost like a travel brochure for me when I was younger. I thought one day I'm going to go to Peru.
When I was young, it gave me an interest in the world.
It's got that kind of yearning for new lands, and it's got Aztecs and Mayans, and it's got sacrifice, and it's a great adventure, and it's got all the perfect cliffhangers in it, and it's got spitting llamas, and it's got lots of humour, and I think this is one of the most terrific adventures that he has.
Again, it's the James Bond thing, the world is my office, and I think the way that he moves around the world as a free agent and mixes in all these cultures, he's always open-minded towards the cultures, and he's never closed off towards them. I think that's a post-Second World War, 20th century lifestyle. So I think he's a moderniser. And it certainly encouraged me to feel that I could move around the world with freedom.
For more than a year, Eni Weetok, a lonely Pacific atoll, has kept a secret which these pictures reveal for the first time. This was Operation Greenhouse, an atomic explosion designed to show the devastating effect of the blast
years I have reread Calculus Affair, which is possibly my favorite. I think Hergé was great when he did international politics, and I think that beefs up his stories.
The Americans and the Soviets were also locked in a race to the moon, and over a decade before anyone would make the landing, Hergé transported Tintin to the moon in espionage classics.
Men had gone on to explore the realms beyond, into the dizzy heights of space, onward toward the planets. There lies the new course for brave men with wings. Up there is the everlasting monument to Wilbur and Orville Wright.
I was fascinated by the idea going to the moon, and suddenly the Soviets, the communists, are way ahead of us. And the notion was that they were technologically backward. And suddenly they're there. They put the first man up in orbit. They send the first craft to hit the moon, to go around the moon. The Americans were absolutely, yeah. And the rest of the Western world is kind of a... So Hergé didn't have this as a trigger. I think he just... That was a normal thing to do, you know. Send Tintin to the moon.
The stories came 16 years before the actual Apollo moon landings, and the technology was still being developed. But again, Hergé's research and attention to detail made the stories seem accurate.
For a long time, the moon was just about everything. It was at the limit of imagination. So why bother with galaxies and stars? You know, you could base a science fiction story and they cost money. They were not cheap at all. And I remember seeing these two books and drooling, you know. And it was years before I managed to read them. And the covers were really kind of mind-blowing, you know, this huge, a souped-up German rocket.
Yeah, I think he based the rocket on the German V2 rocket, didn't he? And he scrupulously researched it to get as much as he could. Hergé was always scrupulously accurate about the machines that Tintin encountered. It was one of the ways that he must have retained the interest of the boys who were reading the comics.
And I think that's the stories that really turned Tintin into an international star, because all young readers could relate to that. All young boys dreamt of going to the moon.
Hergé had created a brand in Tintin. His signature on the covers was as famous as Tintin's face. The Adventures of Tintin was selling millions all over the world. Although the success was well received, it meant Hergé had more pressure to mass produce. Through the decades, as Tintin's popularity had grown, Hergé was under pressure to use assistants to help with production.
When you're working on your own, which he mostly was, you can become quite obsessed. Hergé became like a brand in the way Disney became a brand, and most people assumed that Uncle Walt did all of the drawings and all of the animations. Because Hergé had a team of people under him working, and when people asked for a credit or their name mentioned on the artwork, he always flatly refused. He wanted it just to be branded Hergé.
I mean, I think clearly Hergé was a man who would like to have been left alone. All the stuff about collaboration and all of that. I think he was a man who wanted to sit in his room and draw and create these cartoons that he clearly loved so dearly.
His first collaboration dated back to King Ottokar's scepter, when he asked Edgar P. Jacobs to help with the complicated costumes and landscapes.
Jacobs' graphic work was very, very striking. The archetype of the clear line technique with a great sense of colors, especially earth colors, color schemes, you know, that wash through series of pages.
By the 1950s, Tintin was a recognized brand, and Hergé had spawned a team of artists to help produce Tintin. The art of the drawings had developed even more, making the illustrations near perfect.
The technical side of the drawing became even more perfect. I mean, tanks were an actual model of tank. I don't think he needed to. I mean, he had a perfectly a marvelous technique. Yeah, that's even his latest stories. They look wonderful, but I think he just kind of he became more involved in editing and possibly in running the business.
By the late 1950s, Hergé fell in love with Fanny Vlamink, an assistant at his studios. He had been married since 1932 and wrestled with the idea of divorce. During this time, he repeatedly had nightmares that he said showed the beauty and cruelty of white. He eventually divorced his wife, and this difficult period and the nightmares he suffered inspired Tintin in Tibet.
Tintin!
Chang!
Thundering typhoons, Tintin.
I just had the most awful dream. It was about my friend Chang. He'd been in a plane crash and was calling out to me for help.
You find Tintin in complete anguish because he's had a dream that his old friend Chang from the Blue Lotus is dead. And so he travels out to Tibet and sets out to find him.
2 decades had passed since Hergé had made contact with his friend Chang, but life would eventually imitate art as the two were reunited in 1981.
Who's there?
Chang! Chang, you're safe!
Tintin, I knew you would come.
Tintin in Tibet, I think, is interesting, and he talks about that being his own nightmares, being a land of white, and recreating that in Tintin in Tibet.
There you have the start of the book, and the colours are European, and they're the classic colours of Tintin. And so you don't have to read a single word, you know where you are and you know who it is. But then later in the book, when he gets, to Tibet or Nepal, look at the difference. It's an icy world, it's a scary one, it's a dangerous world. The blue hints at danger.
So within that kind of haunting white snowscape of the Himalayas, we have Tintin wandering around in some emotional distress. I believe that Hergé wrote it at a time when he had just divorced his wife and was in quite a bleak place himself. And it's interesting how that is reflected in the text itself.
There's a real dignity as well to the way that the local characters are portrayed in this, I think. Here's Tintin with a local Tibetan guy, and they're kind of equals, they're similar. It's kind of showing the fact that, Tintin is like similar people like him in another part of the world. That's a massive change from the early ones in the Congo. It's almost as if Hergé is kind of trying to perhaps make up for the sins of his youth or the perceived sins of racism. That kind of shows the journey that Hergé makes, I think, as a person and as an artist.
3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport. Greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element. Some of the fences hold, others do not. A minor miracle is mounted by the fact that there are no injuries spread among the near hysterical crowd. This truly is a social document for our time.
By the 1960s, the world had changed. Pop culture and rock and roll would contest the world of comic books. Hergé's audience had evolved once more.
Young people whose main concern were the length of their hair and the guitar and scoring with the girls, it became more and more difficult to attract their attention.
Art and literature was also in a state of transformation, and the graphic novel was not immune to change.
Hergé knew that there would be an end to it. You couldn't keep that young chap in his blue sweater and +4s just going around the world.
Hergé was slowing down, with his books being released less frequently. Tintin's last 3 adventures were released over 13 years.
You find quite an interesting progression as we go through the books. You know, the first are written in the 30s, the later ones are written sort of in the 60s and 70s. But it's interesting now to come back to the books with that knowledge, and there's another level on which you can read them, I think, by looking at them through Hergé's own internal struggle in his own politics and how that changed over time.
Hergé was known for changing his stance on certain beliefs, which he showed through the eyes of Tintin. With 22 adventures produced, Hergé's journey as an author can be mapped.
He has been questioned about his politics. I think he's quite honest about it, about changing his mind in certain periods of history. You know, you have to be open to change your opinions, and it would be hard to comment in such a broad sweep about such many countries as he did in changing times without being wrong-footed by history a few times.
Especially the 20th century, which was the most murderous century ever.
I suppose when, you know, the Germans took over the paper he was writing the comic strip for, people saw him as a collaborator, when in fact he was again just fitting into the circumstance. So, you know, Catholicism to start with, sort of the Nazis that followed next, you know, and then later on his sort of views kind of changed from sort of right to left. Because I think to say he was easily influenced makes him sound as if he was weak-minded, so, which he isn't. He's clearly strong-minded. But assimilating other people's views and trying on other people's shoes effectively maybe gave him a different perspective.
There's always been a degree in which kind of Tintin has sort of been on my shoulder. When I first rocked up in South America, I couldn't but think of Tintin with the picaros, or the first time I went to the Himalayas and all that stuff. Tintin was just with me all along the ride.
Hergé's legacy lives on in the adventures of Tintin. The characters appear in film and figurines, but the books will always stay the same.